This is a direct order from a superior officer under Joint Operations Protocol, the Russian Marine major shouted as he barged through the checkpoint, forcefully pushing the Royal Guard's rifle aside. But then Lance Corporal Mitchell did the unthinkable. He broke protocol and stood his ground. What he said next, spoken in flawless Russian, didn't just silence the room, it shattered the major's illusion of authority on the spot. So what exactly did the guard say that turned everything upside down? Before we reveal it, make sure to subscribe and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Now, let's get into what really happened. London's early morning fog rolled across the ancient courtyard of St. James's Palace, wrapping around centuries-old stonework like ghostly fingers. In this hallowed space where kings once walked, Lance Corporal Thomas Hayes maintained his vigil, crimson uniform immaculate against the gray morning light. His burskin cap sat precisely positioned, casting shadows over eyes that had witnessed horrors most civilians could never imagine. To passing tourists, he appeared as nothing more than colorful pageantry, a living museum piece frozen in time. The steady stream of visitors flowed past his position like water around a stone. French families debated the historical significance of the monarchy in hushed tones, while American tourists marveled at the authentic British experience they were witnessing. German students counted the buttons on his tunic for their history assignment, and elderly couples reminisced about their own military service decades past. Hayes heard every word, cataloged every face, assessed every potential threat with the automatic precision of someone trained to survive in the world's most dangerous places. Through the morning bustle came the distinctive sound of military boots on cobblestone, measured, heavy, purposeful. The rhythm belonged to someone accustomed to command, someone who expected others to move aside when they approached. Major Alexei Volkov emerged from the mist like a figure from a Cold War thriller, his Russian naval uniform pristine despite the early hour. The 45-year-old officer's chest displayed an impressive collection of campaign ribbons and decorations that caught what little sunlight penetrated the overcast sky. Volkov had spent the previous evening at a reception hosted by the Russian cultural attaché, where conversation had turned to British military traditions. Several embassy officials had dismissed the Royal Guard as theatrical nonsense, suggesting that modern British soldiers were soft compared to their Russian counterparts. The vodka-fueled discussion had planted a seed of contempt in Volkov's mind. Here was an opportunity to demonstrate Russian military superiority in the most public way possible. The tourists began to sense something different in the atmosphere. As Volkov approached, his predatory gait and cold expression triggered primitive warning signals in the civilians around him. Parents instinctively pulled their children closer. Elderly visitors stepped aside, and even the most enthusiastic photographers lowered their cameras slightly. The man, radiating authority and barely contained aggression, was clearly not part of the scheduled entertainment. Volkov's pale blue eyes fixed on Hayes with laser intensity, studying him like a scientist examining a specimen. The British Guard appeared young, perhaps late 20s, standing rigidly in his elaborate ceremonial dress. The ornate uniform with its golden braiding and polished buttons looked more appropriate for a theatrical production than serious military duty. To Volkov's experienced eye, this was exactly the kind of soft Western soldier who had never faced real combat, never tested himself against genuine adversity. What Volkov couldn't know was that beneath the ceremonial facade stood a veteran of 3 deployments to Afghanistan and 2 classified operations in the Balkans. Hayes had earned his place in the Coldstream Guards through merit, not ceremony. His selection for palace duty represented recognition of his ability to maintain discipline under any circumstances, a quality that would be tested more severely today than during any Taliban ambush he'd survived. British soldier. Volkov's voice boomed across the courtyard, causing several tourists to jump and reach reflexively for their phones. I am Major Alexei Volkov of the Russian Federation Navy. Stand aside, I require immediate access to your commanding officers. The demand carried the weight of absolute authority, delivered by someone accustomed to instant obedience. In Volkov's experience, junior personnel scattered like leaves when confronted by superior rank, regardless of nationality. He had used this approach successfully throughout his career, from naval academies in Severodvinsk to joint exercises with foreign militaries. Across 3 continents, Hayes remained statue still, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond the palace walls. Years of training had conditioned him to maintain position regardless of provocation, whether from drunken tourists, aggressive protesters, or foreign military officers with inflated egos. His breathing remained steady, his posture unchanged, his expression revealing nothing of the threat assessment occurring behind his eyes. The growing crowd of spectators began pulling out cameras and phones, sensing that something unusual was about to unfold. A Japanese tour group clustered together, their guide speaking in rapid whispers about British military protocol. American college students edged closer, excited by the prospect of witnessing genuine drama. An elderly British couple backed away disapprovingly, the husband muttering something about foreign rudeness while his wife shook her head in dismay. Volkov's initial confidence began to crack as his demand met with stony silence. In his world, military hierarchy was absolute. Junior officers deferred to senior ones without question, regardless of circumstances. The fact that this British guard wasn't immediately acknowledging his authority represented either unprecedented disrespect or stunning ignorance of proper military protocol. "Did you not hear my order, soldier?" Volkov stepped closer, his voice rising with each word. "I said stand aside. In the Russian Navy, subordinates show proper respect to their superiors." He gestured aggressively at his rank insignia, the movement causing his campaign ribbons to catch the light. Each decoration represented battles fought in places most civilians couldn't pronounce: Chechnya, Georgia, Syria, conflicts that had forged him into the warrior he'd become. A metropolitan police constable stationed nearby had begun moving in their direction, his trained eye recognizing the escalating tension. The palace's sophisticated security system was undoubtedly tracking every moment, with alerts already pinging on screens in underground command centers. But protocol dictated that the guard handle initial provocations independently, only requesting assistance if the situation exceeded his training parameters. Hayes's mind briefly flashed to Helmand province, to firefights with Taliban insurgents, who had tested his resolve far more severely than this posturing Russian officer. He remembered the night his unit had been surrounded for 16 hours, maintaining position while coordinating artillery support via radio. That experience had taught him that true strength came not from shouting or posturing, but from unwavering discipline under pressure. The crowd continued to grow as word spread through social media that something interesting was happening at the palace. Street vendors began repositioning themselves to capitalize on the increased foot traffic, while professional photographers arrived, alerted by freelance journalists who monitored police scanners for potential stories. Every angle was being documented, every expression captured for potential future use. A small child in the crowd pointed at Hayes and asked his mother in a piping voice, "Why won't the guard talk to the angry man?" The question carried clearly across the courtyard, prompting knowing smiles from British onlookers familiar with the tradition of the guard's stoic silence. But to Volkov, it represented further evidence of what he perceived as British military weakness, a soldier who wouldn't defend himself when challenged. The standoff intensified as Volkov realized that conventional intimidation wasn't producing the desired result. His reputation had been built on never backing down from confrontation, on being the most commanding presence in any situation. The fact that this British guard was simply ignoring him felt like a personal affront to everything he had built his identity around. "Perhaps you are deaf as well as disrespectful," Volkov sneered, circling Hayes like a predator studying prey. "Or maybe British military training no longer includes basic courtesy toward allied forces?" His boots clicked against the cobblestones in a deliberate rhythm designed to unnerve, a psychological technique learned from KGB instructors during his early career. Hayes had undergone resistance to interrogation training that made Volkov's amateur intimidation tactics seem childish by comparison. He had been subjected to far more sophisticated psychological pressure by professionals, whose sole purpose was breaking mental defenses. A frustrated naval officer with wounded pride hardly registered as a threat compared to the Taliban fighters, who had once held him captive for 36 hours in a cave complex near Kandahar. The crowd now numbered over 60 people, creating a loose amphitheater of spectators around the confrontation. Tour guides were redirecting their groups to maintain safe distances, while still providing good viewing angles for their clients. The scene had taken on an almost theatrical quality, with Hayes as the stoic protagonist and Volkov as the aggressive antagonist in a drama none of them had paid to see. A senior palace administrator had emerged from a side entrance, clipboard in hand, observing the situation from a discreet distance. His presence indicated that the incident had escalated sufficiently to warrant official attention, though he made no move to intervene directly. This was a test of the guard's training and professionalism. Premature assistance would undermine the very protocols they existed to protect. Volkov's frustration was reaching dangerous levels now. Every technique he had relied upon throughout his military career was proving ineffective against this silent British soldier. The lack of response was more unnerving than active resistance would have been, at least then. He could have escalated to physical confrontation where his size and experience would have given him clear advantages. The psychological warfare entered a new phase as Volkov shifted tactics. From direct intimidation to calculated insult. "You know what I think," he said, his voice dropping to a conversational tone that somehow seemed more menacing than his earlier shouting. "I think the famous British military is not what it once was, all ceremony, no substance, pretty uniforms for tourists, but no real fighting spirit left." The attack was precisely calibrated to provoke a response, questioning a soldier's combat effectiveness struck at the core of professional identity, challenging not just individual competence, but national military reputation. Volkov had used similar psychological tactics during interrogations in Chechnya, finding that personal attacks often succeeded where physical coercion failed. But Hayes's training had prepared him for exactly this type of manipulation. His SAS attachment had included advanced psychological conditioning, designed to maintain operational security under extreme duress. He had learned to separate his ego from his mission, to view provocations as information rather than personal attacks. A drunk Russian major with authority issues hardly compared to the enhanced interrogation techniques he had successfully resisted during classified training exercises. The autumn breeze carried the mingled scents of London morning coffee from nearby shops, exhaust from distant traffic, the earthy smell of fallen leaves decomposing on ancient stones. It was the kind of crisp day that made tourists fall in love with the city, though the growing tension at the palace gates was providing memories quite different from what most visitors had expected. Professional photographers were now documenting every moment, recognizing that they were witnessing something genuinely newsworthy. The possibility of diplomatic incident involving Russian military personnel was too significant to ignore, especially given current tensions between the two nations. Every expression, every gesture was being captured from multiple angles for potential future publication. A businessman hurrying to work paused to watch, then pulled out his phone to call his wife. "You won't believe what I'm seeing at the palace," he whispered excitedly. "Some Russian officer is having a complete meltdown at one of the guards. The guard isn't even acknowledging him. It's the most British thing I've ever witnessed." Volkov's desperation was becoming increasingly apparent to trained observers. His initial confident aggression had given way to increasingly frantic attempts to provoke any kind of response. The silence he was encountering was more devastating than active resistance would have been. It suggested that his target considered him beneath notice, unworthy of even acknowledgement. "In the Russian Navy," Volkov declared loudly, clearly playing to the crowd now, "we have a saying, a sailor who will not defend his honor will not defend his ship." He paused for effect, then added with obvious contempt, "But perhaps British soldiers have forgotten what honor means in their soft Western society." The insult was designed to cut deep, attacking not just Hayes personally, but British military culture as a whole. Several British spectators in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the escalation in rhetoric. The confrontation was moving beyond simple military posturing into territory that could have genuine diplomatic consequences. Hayes's mind briefly touched on memories that remained classified operations in Eastern Europe, where he had worked alongside intelligence assets, missions that had prevented terrorist attacks on British soil, actions that had earned him decorations he couldn't wear and recognition he couldn't acknowledge. If Volkov only knew that the ceremonial toy soldier he was insulting had once spent a week behind enemy lines in the Balkans, coordinating airstrikes while surrounded by hostile forces. A Metropolitan Police inspector had arrived on scene, called by the constable who had been monitoring the deteriorating situation. Inspector Reynolds was a veteran of 20 years' experience dealing with diplomatic incidents, protest situations, and international tensions played out on London streets. His trained eye quickly assessed the dynamics. Foreign military officer losing control, British Guard maintaining exemplary discipline, crowd growing larger and more restless. The inspector's approach was textbook diplomatic de-escalation. "Gentlemen," he said, addressing both Hayes and Volkov with equal courtesy, "I'm Inspector Reynolds. Major Volkov, if you have official business requiring palace access, I'd be pleased to assist you in contacting the appropriate diplomatic channels through your embassy." It was a masterful intervention, acknowledging Volkov's rank and apparent legitimacy while firmly establishing that proper procedures needed to be followed. The offer provided an elegant exit strategy for a situation that had spiraled well beyond anyone's original intentions. The critical moment arrived when Volkov, emboldened by what he perceived as continued British weakness, committed the act that would transform this incident from diplomatic embarrassment into international news. Reaching out with one heavy hand, he deliberately struck Hayes's bearskin cap, knocking it askew on his head. The crowd gasped collectively. Even tourists with no understanding of military protocol recognized that the line between verbal confrontation and physical assault had been crossed. Cameras zoomed in, capturing the moment when international incident became inevitable. Social media posts began flooding platforms with hashtags like #PalaceAssault and #RussianIncident. But Hayes's response defied every expectation. Instead of the explosion of anger that Volkov anticipated, or the continued stoic silence that the crowd had grown accustomed to, Hayes did something that no one could have predicted. He spoke, and when he did, the words flowed in perfect, unaccented Russian. "Major Volkov," Hayes said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent courtyard. Article 31 of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations explicitly prohibits military personnel from bypassing host nation security protocols. You will step back immediately and pursue your business through proper diplomatic channels. The effect was electric. Volkov's face cycled through surprise, confusion, and dawning horror as he realized he had catastrophically misjudged his opponent. The crowd, most unable to understand the words, but certainly appreciating the dramatic reversal, began murmuring excitedly among themselves. Phone cameras pivoted to capture Volkov's shocked expression from every conceivable angle. Hayes's Russian wasn't just fluent, it carried the subtle pronunciation markers of someone who had learned the language through operational immersion rather than academic study. His accent held traces of military terminology usage, suggesting experience with Russian armed forces personnel in professional contexts. To Volkov's trained ear, this was clearly someone with intelligence or special operations background. The revelation shattered every assumption Volkov had made about the confrontation. This wasn't some ceremonial toy soldier, this was an operative with capabilities that extended far beyond ceremonial duties. His mind raced through the implications, paranoia flooding in as he considered whether he had walked into an elaborate intelligence trap. The power dynamic had shifted completely. What began as a confident Russian military officer intimidating a ceremonial British guard had suddenly become something far more complex and dangerous. Volkov found himself facing an opponent whose capabilities and background were entirely unknown, whose calm competence suggested training and experience that matched or exceeded his own. "You speak Russian," Volkov stammered, the first crack appearing in his authoritative facade. The words came out in his native language, as if English had temporarily deserted him in his shock. "Who are you? What is your real assignment here?" But Hayes had revealed all he intended to. Having made his point and shifted the psychological balance, he returned to his stoic silence, eyes once again fixed on the distant horizon. The brief glimpse behind the ceremonial facade had been carefully calculated enough to neutralize Volkov's aggression without compromising operational security or violating protocol. The crowd was buzzing with excitement now, recognizing that they had witnessed something genuinely extraordinary. Those who spoke Russian were translating for their companions, adding layers of commentary and speculation. The incident was already spreading across social media platforms, with amateur video footage being shared and reshared by thousands of users worldwide. Inspector Reynolds stepped forward, recognizing that the situation required immediate professional management. "Major Volkov," he said firmly but diplomatically, "I believe there may have been some misunderstanding about access procedures. If you have legitimate business with palace officials, I can arrange for you to be connected with the appropriate diplomatic liaisons through your embassy." The offer represented Volkov's last opportunity to exit the situation with some semblance of dignity intact. Everyone present understood that this was the moment of decision: accept the face-saving compromise, or escalate into genuinely dangerous territory that could have career-ending consequences for everyone involved. Palace security officials monitoring from their underground command center were already implementing contingency protocols. Background checks on Volkov were being expedited. Diplomatic notifications were being prepared, and additional personnel were being positioned discreetly around the perimeter in case the situation required more aggressive intervention. Volkov stood frozen, his mind struggling to process the complete reversal of fortune he had experienced. 30 minutes earlier, He had approached what he assumed was a ceremonial target, confident in his ability to demonstrate Russian military superiority. Now he faced the possibility of international humiliation, diplomatic complaint, and serious consequences for his naval career. The alcohol still affecting his judgment prevented him from recognizing the elegant exit strategy Inspector Reynolds had provided. His ego, bruised by the unexpected revelation of Hayes's capabilities, demanded some form of vindication. But his military training, honed by decades of experience, warned him that further escalation could only end badly. "This is not finished," Volkov muttered in English. Though his words lacked the conviction they had carried earlier, the threat sounded hollow even to his own ears. The bluster of someone who had lost control of a situation he had initiated. "My embassy will hear of this treatment. There will be consequences." Hayes remained at his post throughout this exchange, his presence a constant reminder of British military professionalism. Triumphing over foreign aggression, he had demonstrated competence without compromising security, maintained dignity throughout provocation, and upheld the honor of his uniform through disciplined restraint. Rather than aggressive response, the crowd had grown to over 100 spectators. Now, creating substantial documentation of the incident, multiple camera angles, professional photography, and countless social media posts ensured that this confrontation would be preserved and analyzed for years to come. It was becoming a textbook example of how cultural misunderstandings could escalate into international incidents. A senior diplomat from the Russian embassy had been summoned and was making his way through London traffic, already crafting explanations for what was clearly going to be an embarrassing incident requiring delicate damage control. The cultural attaché who had hosted the previous evening's reception was also en route, mentally preparing himself for difficult conversations with both his superiors in Moscow and his British counterparts. The autumn sun climbed higher, burning through the morning mist and casting sharper shadows across the ancient courtyard. The improved visibility seemed to highlight the contrast between the two military cultures on display: Russian assertiveness meeting British restraint, individual aggression encountering institutional discipline. The final act of this diplomatic drama played out with the measured pace of ancient ritual, meeting modern crisis management. Inspector Reynolds maintained his position between the principals, representing British law enforcement's commitment to peaceful resolution even as he prepared for potential escalation. His radio crackled quietly with updates from colleagues monitoring the situation from multiple vantage points. "Major Volkov," the inspector said with patient authority, "I'm going to ask you one final time to accept our assistance in resolving this matter. Through proper diplomatic channels, your embassy staff are being notified and can help clarify any procedural questions you may have." The offer carried implicit warning alongside diplomatic courtesy. Everyone present understood that refusal would result in more direct intervention, with consequences that would extend far beyond personal embarrassment. The incident had already generated enough documentation to occupy diplomatic staff for weeks. Further escalation would only multiply the complications. Hayes stood throughout this final exchange like a monument to military discipline, his brief moment of revelation having accomplished its purpose. He had proven that beneath the ceremonial uniform beat the heart of a professional warrior, someone whose capabilities extended far beyond what casual observation might suggest. The lesson would not be lost on anyone who witnessed it. The crowd began to sense that the confrontation was reaching its conclusion. The dramatic peak had passed with Hayes's linguistic demonstration, and now they were witnessing the bureaucratic aftermath that inevitably followed international incidents. Some spectators began drifting away, satisfied that they had captured enough footage for their social media accounts, and confident that the situation would resolve without further violence. As the clock on a nearby building chimed the half-hour, marking exactly 30 minutes since Major Alexei Volkov had first approached Lance Corporal Thomas Hayes's post, the incident that would become known as the Palace Protocol confrontation drew to its close. Neither participant could have predicted how those 30 minutes would unfold, but both would carry the memory for the remainder of their military careers. The ancient stones of St. James's Palace had witnessed another chapter in the long history of diplomatic tensions, cultural misunderstandings, and the enduring power of professional military bearing. In the end, quiet competence had triumphed over loud aggression, institutional discipline had overcome individual bluster, and the traditions that had protected British monarchy for centuries had proven their worth once again. In the modern world,